Britishers came to rule the entire Indian subcontinent, they brought about a lot of changes, be that in the political sphere, in the socio-economic and cultural spheres. And the lives of the tribals have not been any exception. Having been introduced to the various ways of living that the tribals pursued in our previous lesson, let us now take into account how their lives drastically changed and altered with the coming of the Britishers in the Indian subcontinent. So our focus of this lesson would be the impact of the British rule on tribal lives. Now, when the Britishers came to rule the Indian subcontinent, the tribal chiefs lost the power and the autonomy that they previously had. But in order to discuss this, we will have to time travel back to the period when the Britishers had not made their way to the Indian subcontinent. Earlier on, different tribes used to live in different regions, and they lived mostly in the forested and hilly regions. Now here, the tribals lived independent and autonomous lives. They lived outside the mainstream societies and they were quite self-sufficient. They grew whichever foods they wanted and they consumed those food items. They also relied upon herbs and shrubs for medicinal purposes. From all these points, we can understand that the tribals led very self-sufficient lives. And many of these tribals had more power over the rest of the tribals. These were the tribal chiefs or the tribal leaders. Now, to have a leader or a chief is very essential in order to give the tribe or any community proper leadership, proper guidance. These tribal leaders took into account a lot of things that pertained to the lives of those particular tribes. What did they take into account? Firstly, most of these tribes had their own administrative systems. They had their own police, own sorts of laws and orders which governed their lives. So they in no way interacted or communicated with the mainstream societies, and in these tribes it were the tribal chiefs or the tribal leaders whose say used to be final. Now, simply by the virtue of being tribal leaders or tribal chiefs, these people used to hold a lot of power in those particular tribes. Now, when the Britishers came to the Indian subcontinent, they evicted the tribals from their own lands. They were compelled to leave behind their lands. They were also compelled to enter the mainstream societies in order to look for jobs with which they could earn a living. So the previous way of living that the tribals had was completely altered and radically changed with the coming of the Britishers in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the tribal leaders who had some power, some authority over the people who lived in those tribes was taken away by the Britishers. That is to say, not just the control over the regions, but the control over the tribals as well went into the hands of the Britishers. The tribal chiefs were divested of all power and authority. But this was not the end. Along with being stripped of all their powers, the tribal chiefs were also compelled to pay huge amounts as tributes to the Britishers. Why were they compelled to pay such huge amounts of tributes? Firstly, these tribal chiefs did not have any power or any authority or any freedom when the Britishers came to rule them. But under the pretext of giving them only their titles without any power and authority, the Britishers charged them huge amounts, and these huge amounts were paid as tributes by the tribal chiefs. From this we can understand how radically and how drastically the lives of various tribes throughout the Indian subcontinent changed with the coming of the Britishers in the country. Earlier on, we have learned that many tribes in different parts of the Indian subcontinent practiced shifting or jhum cultivation. Now the tribes that practiced shifting or jhum cultivation lived in one area or one region for some period of time, after which they moved to a different region where they pursued this kind of agricultural type. Now the Britishers were of the opinion that these tribals were savage and wild. They moved from one place to another and lived mostly in the forested regions. So these people were not at all civilized in the eyes of the Britishers. Along with that, the main aim of the Britishers when they came to the Indian subcontinent was to establish their own rule, their own governance over the people living in the entire subcontinent. And in order to administer these people, in order to govern these people in a more efficient kind of way, the Britishers wanted to establish a uniform administration. Now they realized that it would be impossible for them to govern and control those people who kept on moving from one place to another. Because if these people did not settle down, administrative rules and policies and laws would not be and could not be implemented on them. To this end, the Britishers now wanted the shifting cultivators to settle down, and if they settle down at a fixed place, it would be easier for the Britishers to control and govern them completely. So this was another way in which the lives of the shifting cultivators or the lives of those tribes that pursued shifting cultivation radically changed because of the British rule in the subcontinent. Now, why do you think the Britishers came to the Indian subcontinent and established their rule here? A very important point that they had in mind was the maximization of revenue. They wanted to gain as huge profit from this land as was possible. Firstly, they were doing so by taking away and plundering all the resources that were available in India. But this was not sufficient to them. They wanted to earn more and more revenue. And to this end, the British government in India now introduced certain land settlements. Now, what were these land settlements supposed to do? These were intended to maximize the revenue that was earned by the British government in India. But what did these land settlements talk about? These land settlements defined the relationships between the lands, the landlords and the landless laborers. What did these land settlements do? Firstly, by these land settlements, the Britishers measured the lands. And by measuring the lands, they defined which individual would have power or any authority over those lands. And while they were doing so, the people of India were divided into several categories. Firstly, some people were the landowners. These landowners were given rights over certain tracts of lands. And these landowners were not the only people, because there were many landless laborers. These people were not assigned or given any tract of land. These landless laborers and peasants were then compelled to work and till on the lands that belonged to the landowners. So in this way, there developed some kind of a relationship among the landowners, the landless peasants and the lands. Now let me explain it to you how the revenue was paid to the British government. The landless laborers and the peasants used to work on the lands that belonged to the landowners. Now these peasants and laborers used to pay revenue and taxes to the landowners. And the landowners in turn paid revenue to the British government. And in this way, the British government in India indirectly extorted huge amounts of revenue from those people who were already landless, from those people who were already struggling with poverty. And needless to mention, mostly the tribals who lived outside the societies came under the category of the landless peasants and the landless laborers. Now, along with mentioning certain land settlements, the Britishers also wanted to preserve and protect the forests of India. Why do you think they did so? This is because the forests of India are very rich in different kinds of timber. There are many trees like the sal, the mahogany, which produce very rich kind of timber. Now, the 19th century saw rapid expansion of railway not just in India but in England as well. Now, the Britishers needed more and more timber in order to make the railway sleepers. Now, if the tribals continued to live in the forests, the Britishers were afraid that they would destroy the forests. Which is why, in an attempt to protect the forests, the Britishers now compelled the tribals to evict the forests or to give up living in these forests. These forests were now categorized as state property. These no longer belonged to the tribals, but the tribals have been living in these forests for many centuries, and suddenly out of nowhere they were thrown out of their lands. Can you imagine the plight of these vulnerable people who were already poor, who already did not have the resources to earn their living, and now they were thrown away from their own regions as well. So they were divested of the shelters that they had. So the point that we mentioned just now is that the Britishers wanted to protect those forests which produced timber, and these forests were now categorized as reserved forests. Now, the tribals were not allowed to enter these reserved forests. They had to stay outside these reserved forests. They were thrown out of the places where they have been living for many centuries. Now, before proceeding with this lesson and finding out more how the British rule impacted the lives of various tribes throughout the Indian subcontinent, let me ask you a question. Tribal movement in the reserved forests was not restricted during the colonial period. Do you think this statement is true or false? Well, the correct answer is false. This statement is most definitely false. This is because these reserved forests or the forests which produced timber were protected by the Britishers, and the tribals were not allowed to enter these forests during the colonial rule. We have learned that many tribes were hunter-gatherers. These tribes used to hunt animals which lived in the forested regions, and along with that they used to gather different kinds of forest produce like fruits, vegetables, root, honey, which they consumed as their food. Now, when various forests were categorized as reserved forests, the tribals were not allowed to enter those. The British now prohibited fruit collection in such forests. They were not allowed to hunt animals as well. Now, apart from hunting gathering, we also know that many tribes were practicing shifting cultivation. Jhum cultivation, as the Britishers believed, destroyed the forests completely, which is why they put a ban on jhum cultivation as well. Now, what happened to those tribes, those people who pursued jhum cultivation and gathered their food? Now, the jhum cultivators were thrown out of the forested regions. They were now compelled to pursue or practice settled cultivation. Now, settled cultivation was mostly practiced in the mainstream societies, and here most of the lands were already occupied by different settled cultivators. So it became very difficult for the former jhum cultivators to find good tracts of land. And when they did not find good tracts of land, they had to settle with those lands which were often infertile. These lands were also dry, as in there was paucity of water. The soil quality was also not good. And all these reasons together contributed to the failure of crops. The yield was not good. And it became increasingly difficult for the jhum cultivators to grow their own food crops and gather their food. And they were now very angry against the Britishers because their erstwhile way of living was completely changed and altered. It was very difficult for them to feed themselves, which is why many former jhum cultivators now started revolting against the British colonial rule. So in ways more than one, the lives of the tribals were jeopardized by the British rule in the Indian subcontinent. Now when the jhum cultivators were revolting, the Britishers also realized that it would be difficult for them to settle those jhum cultivators somewhere, because they knew that they could not give proper tracts of lands to the jhum cultivators. And along with that, when the jhum cultivators left the forested regions, it also became difficult for the Britishers to enter the forests. Why is it so? Because it were these tribals who helped the Britishers in the clearing of forests, in the cutting of trees. We have learned that the Britishers needed timber for the construction of railway sleepers. And do you think the Britishers themselves entered the forests to cut the trees and gather all the trunks and logs? Most definitely not. For this purpose, they exploited the tribals who lived in the forested regions. And when the tribals were no longer living in the forested regions, the Britishers also realized that they needed the tribals in those places. So what did the Britishers do? They now started providing small tracts of lands to the jhum cultivators. Now, do you think this was a very good intentioned act on the part of the Britishers? Do you think they were actually trying to help the jhum cultivators? Most definitely not. They did not have any such intention of helping the jhum cultivators. It was all for themselves. They needed the jhum cultivators firstly to cut the trees and to gather the logs and barks. And when they gave the jhum cultivators small tracts of lands to cultivate, they now started extorting labor from them. So the cultivators who were now given small tracts of land in which they could pursue or practice jhum cultivation were compelled to provide labor services to the forest department. From this, a very important point that we need to keep in our minds is that the Britishers never did anything to help or make the lives of the tribals any better. It was all done in order to earn more revenue, in order to take care of their own selfish interests. So there were a whole lot of forest laws, and one such forest law categorized the reserved forests. We have already talked about how these forest laws were oppressive, how these forest laws compelled the tribals to leave their lands, to evict the lands that belonged to them. Now they were very infuriated. It was not at all possible for them to come to terms with the laws that the Britishers were imposing on them, because they were seething with anger. What did this lead to? This led to many rebellions against the oppressive forest laws that were instituted by the British government. Now all these tribal rebellions that broke out in different parts of the subcontinent were an act of reclaiming their own rights. The tribals were trying to reclaim and reassert their authority, their autonomy through these tribal rebellions. We have learnt about the forest laws and how those impacted the lives of the tribals in different parts of the subcontinent. Now in the 18th century, Indian silk was in great demand in the European markets. India produced a very fine kind of silk, and it was a very well sold commodity in various European markets. To this end, the British government in India now thought of something, because they were trying to maximize their revenue, as we have already learnt. What did they think of doing in this regard? The company officials now tried to encourage and boost the production of silk in the country. Why did they do so? Because they wanted to exploit these people to produce more and more silk, which they could take with them back to England and trade in the European markets. Now, who were the people who were producing silk in the Indian subcontinent around this time? Well, it were the Santals of Hazaribagh who reared cocoons. Now, cocoons are required for the production of silk. On this map of present-day India, you could locate Hazaribagh. It is situated in the present-day Indian state of Jharkhand. Now, do you think that it was very easy for these people to produce silk when they were compelled to meet the growing demands? Most definitely not, because the Britishers exploited these people as well, as in the Santals of Hazaribagh as well. How did they exploit these people? Now, they had to produce huge amounts of silk in very less amount of time. And at the same time, they were compelled to produce as many as 1000 cocoons for just 2 or 3 Indian rupees. And when these cocoons were then sold at Bardhaman or Gaya, these were sold at around 4 to 5 times the prices which were paid to the Santals of Hazaribagh. So can you understand how this chain of oppression was working? These people who put so much effort into producing these cocoons were paid so little for all the efforts they put into the production of silk. And the Britishers, without any worries, without any anxiety about how they were exploiting the tribals, they traded all these at a very high price in the European markets. Now, I am sure most of you are very fond of going out on trips. When you go out on trips, you enjoy your time at new places. You get to explore those places. But what if you are compelled to leave your home and are taken to some new region which is completely unfamiliar and alien to you? Will you really feel happy? Will you really enjoy that experience? Most definitely not, because the sense of volition that you have in the trips you undertake will not be there when you will be compelled to go somewhere. Just a while ago, we talked about how the silk producers in the subcontinent were exploited during the colonial rule. But those were not the only people who were exploited by the Britishers, because many other people were compelled to give up their own lands and they were taken to work at tea plantations. Now, tea plantations emerged in different parts of the Indian subcontinent, be that in the eastern and the northeastern regions or in some southern regions as well. Now, tea was and still is a very popular beverage among the Britishers. A lot of Britishers consume tea, which is why when they were ruling the Indian subcontinent, they wanted more and more production of tea. And the tribals who were thrown out of their own lands, who were thrown out of the forested regions, were taken to those tea plantations and they were compelled to work there. At the same time, many tribals were also compelled and forced to work in the mines. Now, the mining industry had also developed in the Indian subcontinent around this time because it was required for the production of different kinds of metals. These metals were used for producing different kinds of goods which were traded by the Britishers. So, all you can see is that a chain was working, and in this chain of exploitation, it were mostly the tribals who were caught. So, the point that we need to keep in mind here is that these tribals were recruited in large numbers to work at the tea plantations of Assam. So, Assam produces huge amounts of tea even today. and the tribals who were thrown out of their lands had to either migrate to Assam to work in the tea plantations or to Jharkhand, where they had to work in the coal mines. Now the tribals were very unhappy with this change in their lives, because all this while the tribals had been living very independent lives. They had the freedom to move within their own forested lands. And at the same time, they did not have to lose their honor, their dignity. But when they were thrown out of their own lands and taken to such alien places, they were not at all happy. And more often than not, the tea plantation owners or the coal mine owners exploited these people. They were living in very unhealthy and unhygienic living conditions. They did not get their food properly. They were taken away from their family members. So in all possible ways, the tribals who were taken away to these places to work in different industries or in different mines had been living miserable lives. So from all this, it was inevitable that revolts and rebellions broke out at different parts of the subcontinent. These tribals were firstly rebelling and revolting against the loss of their autonomy, the loss of their independence. And along with that, many unfair laws and taxes were imposed on them. These were very oppressive. How was it possible for these poor people to pay those high amounts of taxes? It was impossible for them, which is why they were enmeshed in severe financial losses. They were enmeshed in debts. They were exploited by the Dikus in all possible ways, and so inevitably rebellions broke out. Among the many tribal rebellions that broke out in the Indian subcontinent, some had been very popular. These gained mass popularity, and some of those would be the Coal Rebellion that lasted between 1831 and 1832, the Santhal Rebellion that lasted in 1855. We just talked about the Santhals of Hazaribagh, who used to rear cocoons and how they were exploited when there was a growing demand for Indian silk. Now other rebellions also broke out in the likes of the Basta Rebellion that broke out in the first part of the 20th century, that is in 1910, and the Warli Revolt that broke out in 1940. So this brings us to an end of our discussion on how the tribals' lives were impacted by the British colonial rule. They were thrown out of their lands. Their earlier ways of living were supplanted by the Britishers completely. They were no longer allowed to enter the forests where they had been living for centuries. They could no longer pursue hunting, gathering, or practice shifting or jhum cultivation. And at the same time, they were taken away from their homes, from their families, and were compelled to work in different and unfamiliar settings. So it goes without saying that rebellions and revolts had broken out. If someone takes you away from your home and compels you to work in inhuman living conditions, you will be very angered, you will be infuriated, and you will want to rebel. That is what these tribals were doing. In a subsequent lesson, we will focus on one such tribal rebellion, and that will introduce us to a great and dauntless tribal chief without whose mention any discussion on tribal rebellions in the Indian subcontinent shall remain incomplete. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.